Normally, in a UK general election, there's lots of issues at play. It's, 650 seats are up for grabs in Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. And normally, of course, Scotland plays a role in that. It used to have 72, 73 seats. After 2005, it went down to 59. But the Labour Party always won the majority of those, and so whenever Labour was in government, Scotland was an important part of that. But rarely in a general election context is Scotland discussed in the rest of the UK. Rarely does it dominate the headlines. Rarely does what might happen in a Scottish context loom large in the news media. But that's precisely what's happened this time. Almost as soon as the independence referendum was over in September last year, the ground started being prepared for the general election campaign. And polls started showing that the SNP, despite having lost the referendum, they were the major party in the Yes campaign, that they were polling extremely well. And thus, gradually, London and the London-based media and politicians at Westminster started noticing and realising that Scotland, unlike in previous general elections, was going to be not only important, but very possibly the decisive sort of part of the UK in determining the outcome of the election. And there's lots of reasons for that, not only the popularity of the SNP, but also because it's likely to be another hung parliament. And it's sort of the new normal in a UK context. Until 2010, we were used to majority governments. That's what first past the post, the electoral system, was designed to deliver, and it had delivered at most elections until 2010. February 1974 is an obvious exception. And now, with polls showing that the Conservatives and Labour are level pegging, it's likely, almost certain, we'll have another hung parliament. And so into that, you have Scotland, and specifically the SNP. And interestingly, the SNP have argued at every general election since 1983, I think, elect a strong band of nationalist MPs and we'll hold the balance of power at Westminster. The trouble is it wasn't credible. Without a hung parliament, a majority of voters just didn't recognise that as credible. And even Scottish voters who liked the SNP and were inclined to vote for them didn't in general elections, UK elections, for that reason. And even in 2010, a few years after the SNP first got control of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, they only got 19% in that election, and Labour's share of the vote in Scotland went up by 3%. So that was 5 years ago. But this time, because a hung parliament is widely expected, that SNP narrative, which is very old, that old SNP argument that they could hold the balance of power, suddenly looks perfectly credible. And therefore, many more people appear to be intending to vote SNP, according to the polls, certainly more than double that in 2010. So the game has changed completely. Indeed, the rules of the game, as we understood UK elections to operate by until 2010 or until 2005, is no longer the case.
Do you think there's therefore a need for a guide for voters in Scotland? I mean, don't they know enough about general elections already?
I think they knew about the old way of doing general elections, which was majority government. And in Scotland, most people generally voted Labour. A few decades ago, most voted Conservative. It's difficult to believe now. And if you go even further back, Scotland was a liberal country. So in an interesting way, over the 20th century and the early 21st century, Scotland has moved from being a liberal country to a Conservative country or a Unionist country, and then to a Labour country, and now increasingly an SNP country. So there's lots of very interesting shifts in that. And as a result, general elections, all elections, have become much more complicated, not least because there are now so many more of them. I mean, in the old days, it was just local government elections and Westminster elections. Now, of course, we have the European Parliament, we have the Scottish Parliament since 1999. And, sometimes barely a year goes by without another election or a referendum. And referendums are still a novel feature in a UK political context. So, yeah, things are now a lot more complicated. And, I'm a student of politics, I'm a political journalist, and so it's my job to keep across all this stuff and understand the distinctions and the nuance. But I struggle to keep up sometimes, and therefore, you know, voters who lead busy lives and have jobs and families and so many other legitimate concerns, I think it can, without being patronising, it can be difficult to keep up with what's expected of voters in an electoral context. So yeah, in the old days it was pretty straightforward. You voted for one of the big parties won, and then they formed a government. Since 2010, that's no longer the case. And because coalition politics and hung parliaments are still quite novel to British politics, less so in Scotland and Wales, interestingly, it takes a lot, I think, for some people to sort of steer their way through quite complicated political and constitutional terrain. On the continent, in Germany, in the Scandinavian countries, you know, coalitions are perfectly normal, and voters are much more attuned to the different sort of extrapolations and what might happen. It's still not quite the case in the UK and in Scotland. So yeah, I think a guide setting everything out in as much as it can, and you know, exploring possible outcomes and possible combinations of parties and what might happen further down the line is pretty necessary, actually.
Well, an impression I have of you is that you really are a social democrat, that you do care about open discussion. And I sometimes wonder about Scotland's purported view of itself, which puts a very strong underlining of that capacity. But do you think it always is quite as democratic feeling as it really suggests it is?
All countries, and Scotland is no exception to this, have myths, they have stories they like to tell about themselves. And, you know, usually for obvious reasons, those are quite positive stories. But often the reality is quite different. And I've always been interested in the sort of gap, the space between how we like to see ourselves and how things actually are. And in electoral terms, of course, Scotland has increasingly looked to those in the rest of the UK like a completely different country. That started in the 60s to some extent, became much more obvious in the 70s, and then gathered pace to the extent that, you know, a lot of Scots vote for the SNP, a party which doesn't exist in the rest of the UK. The established parties in England, Labour and the Conservatives, are either in decline or have declined. And so in electoral terms it looks completely different. But if you then ask your average Scot and your average person in England, Wales and Northern Ireland what they think about the sort of meat and veg of politics, so tax rates, health, education and so on, there's not actually a huge difference. There are distinctions between Scotland and England, those are the two most often compared, but they're not huge. So one example, Scotland, it's generally accepted is a pro-European country and pro-immigration. Actually, the figures show you that the average Scot isn't very keen on immigration, at roughly the same level as in England. And when it comes to Europe, a third of Scots want to leave the European Union. Now, that is lower than the general figure in England, but not by a huge amount. And interestingly, England has the reputation as being the sort of anti-immigration Eurosceptic place, when actually that's echoed to some degree, to a large degree in Scotland. But the story, the discourse in Scotland is completely different, partly because politicians have told a different story, and that of course is reflected in the media. So there's a lot of subtlety, there's a lot of nuance there, which elections don't really identify, because at the end of the day you have to put your cross against one party or the other. And it doesn't mean you agree with what that party stands for, intriguingly. You can agree with some of what they stand for. You know, a lot of SNP voters just like the idea that they have this big mission, this big quest for independence. They might not agree with their education policies, for example. Similarly, a lot of traditionally working class Scots would back Labour, sometimes just out of sheer force of habit, because several generations of their family had done so. So there's no clear correlation between a party's agenda and the kind of people it supports. There's lots more going on than that.
In the aftermath of the referendum, there was a feeling that in Scotland things were a bit divided. Do you think that these divisions are still there?
I think there are divisions, and a lot of people don't like acknowledging or talking about this, but if you have a referendum with a binary choice, yes or no, to such a big question. It can't not divide people at the end of the day, and especially when you had such a close result, 45% voting yes on a very high turnout, 55% voting no. Of course, you end up with divisions. Those divisions are not of the violent sort, far from it. Most of the discussion was civilised and democratic. But nevertheless, people end up with completely polarised views of Scotland and the UK. And there is evidence emerging that those who voted no and those who voted yes now have completely different concepts of Scottish politics and the UK, and there's very little crossover. And to some extent that echoes countries like the United States, where political scientists have identified this phenomenon whereby Republicans and Democrats have become increasingly polarized over the past few decades, and even live in completely different places. I don't think we're quite there yet. But there's lots of data emerging about what no voters think of yes voters, what yes voters think of no voters, not necessarily complementary. And in electoral terms, as the polls suggest, the SNP have doubled their support on what they would normally expect to get in a general election. And that follows in the wake of the referendum result. So division might be too strong a word. It certainly strikes a lot of people as too strong a word. But nevertheless, the divergence, the electoral divergence, and also mirrored to an extent in perceptions and attitudes, is quite marked in Scotland, and certainly much more so than it's been in the past 10 years.
I guess finally I'd like to ask you, I get the impression you think politics is fun on some level. You are really interested in the cut and thrust. Why did you get that appetite for this stuff?
It was another general election. It was the 1997 election. I was halfway through my undergraduate days at Aberdeen University. It was my first vote, so it was obviously important in that respect. But it was also another, like this election, obviously seismic event where it was widely expected the Conservatives were going to lose office for the first time in 18 years, a very extended period in government. And there was this sort of, big new, shiny new party, Labour, led by a shiny new leader, Tony Blair. And so, it was a huge period of change. And in Scotland, of course, it was followed by a referendum on devolution and then the first elections to the Scottish Parliament. So that really grabbed my interest and imagination. And it's then I realised for the first time that, politics was important. It'd always been there. I grew up in a political family. My dad had been in the SNP since the 60s. His sister, my aunt, had been a Liberal Democrat councillor. So there was lots of political discussion, but it hadn't captured my imagination until the 97 election. And then, of course, I was about to graduate. I needed to find gainful employment. That ended up being journalism, and I was interested in politics, so I combined the two. So yeah, it goes back to another UK general election in 1997.
And often I hear Westminster being described in Scotland as redundant, as if the democratic power and force of the whole process was dead. Occasionally people talk about the committee system, which is quite rigorous. What's your impression? Do you think Westminster-based democracy is dead? Or you have written about the idea of having a federal UK. Do you think that is really feasible?
Is it feasible? I think it's desirable. Whether it's realistic or feasible is a separate point, and there are lots of different views on that. My view, having worked and observed both the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster Parliament, is that both have strengths and weaknesses. I mean, at Westminster, for example, I think the committee system, the select committees, are strong, genuinely independent, very robust in their analysis and criticism, essentially, of the government. The quality of debate, even in the much maligned House of Lords, is generally quite good. And there's space, because the House of Commons is so much bigger, for independently minded MPs to sort of carve out alternative careers which don't involve becoming a minister. Not as possible at Holyrood, but at the same time, the Scottish Parliament is much more open, much more accessible. That was, two of the central goals when it was established in 1999, much more flexible. But not, I think, to my mind, and this is, of course, is highly subjective, as good at the scrutiny function, and certainly not its committee system. But as I say, they both have strengths and weaknesses, and I sort of fall between a certain segment of the Scottish population who don't like devolution and never have, admittedly quite small, and also those who dismiss Westminster as somehow this imperial relic and isn't worth preserving. I think aspects of it still function very well. But yeah, federalism has long been a sort of constitutional hobby horse of mine, and again, an effort, perhaps a doomed one, to steer a middle course between where we're at the moment and where we used to be, and where indeed we could end up. Federalism, to me, retains the best of both parliaments, retains the best aspects of the new devolved age and also of the old Westminster system, and sort of reboots it, rejuvenates it, gives it a good kick up the backside to make it fit for the 21st century.